Elias Bellamy almost said no the first time Rhett invited him. He had flour on his forearms, a burn mark near his wrist, and a tray of rye loaves cooling behind him when his cousin leaned against the bakery counter with that bright, polished smile Elias had learned not to trust. Rhett always looked like he had just stepped out of a magazine. Clean haircut, expensive coat, watch that probably cost more than Elias made in 3 months. He had the kind of confidence that filled a room before he even opened his mouth. "You should come with me Friday night," Rhett said. "Charity dinner. Creative people. Designers, donors, gallery types. You'd actually like it." Elias looked down at his apron. "That doesn't sound like something I'd like. You need to get out more." That was the kind of sentence people said when they wanted to sound caring without actually caring. Elias had heard it from relatives, customers, and a few men who had matched with him on dating apps, talked sweetly for 3 days, then vanished the moment he suggested meeting somewhere with actual lighting. He wiped his hands on a towel. "Why me?" Rhett smiled wider. "Because you're interesting." There it was. Interesting. Not handsome. Not charming. Not someone Rhett wanted beside him. Interesting, like a strange painting or a story people could repeat later over expensive wine. Elias should have refused right then. But then his phone buzzed on the counter. A message from his younger brother, Milo, asking if they could talk about tuition again after dinner. His mother had physical therapy twice that week, and the insurance had covered less than expected. The bakery was surviving, but survival was not the same as breathing. Rhett noticed the hesitation and moved in like a man who knew exactly where the soft spots were. "There's an appearance fee," he said casually. "Not officially, but I can make sure you get something for helping me out." 500. Elias stared at him. "For one dinner?" "For one dinner." $500 could cover groceries, medicine, and part of Milo's books. $500 could turn a week of panic into a week of pretending everything was fine. So Elias said yes. By Friday evening, he already regretted it. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror of his small apartment in Astoria, tugging at the collar of his navy shirt. It was the nicest one he owned. It fit well enough if he did not lift his arms too high, but the fabric pulled slightly across his shoulders and stomach. He turned sideways, then immediately hated himself for doing it. His mother called from the living room. "You look handsome. You didn't even see me. I'm your mother." "I know." Elias smiled despite himself, then took one last look in the mirror. Big body, broad face, thick arms. A man built like he belonged behind an oven, not under chandeliers. He almost changed into something else, but there was nothing else that would make him look like the kind of man who belonged where Rhett was taking him. So he went. The dinner was held in a private event space above a design foundation in Manhattan. The kind of place with glass walls, soft lighting, and people who seemed to know how to stand without ever looking uncomfortable. The room smelled faintly of white flowers, champagne, and money. Rhett touched Elias's elbow as they entered, not quite guiding him, not quite claiming him. "Just relax," he murmured. "Smile. Don't overthink." Which meant, Elias understood, do not embarrass me. The first few minutes were not terrible. That almost made it worse. People smiled at him. They asked his name. They asked what he did. But every question came with a small pause, a careful glance, a tiny adjustment in tone once they learned he owned a bakery. "Oh, you bake?" one woman asked, her pearls shining at her throat. "Like professionally?" "Yes," Elias said. "Professionally." How charming. Charming was another word like interesting. Soft on the surface, sharp underneath. A man in a cream blazer looked him up and down and said, "I love that. Real food. Real people. We need more of that in these spaces." Elias nodded because he did not trust himself to answer. Real people. As if everyone else in the room had been made in a cleaner, more expensive factory. Rhett was already drifting away, laughing with 2 men near the bar. Elias stood alone with a glass of sparkling water he did not want, trying not to look as uncomfortable as he felt. He became aware of his hands, then his stomach, then the way his shirt touched his skin. He wondered if people could tell he had polished his shoes himself at the kitchen table. At dinner, Rhett placed him at a table near the center of the room. That was when Elias understood. He was not there because Rhett wanted company. He was not there because anyone needed him. He was there because his presence created contrast. Among slim suits, sharp cheekbones, and careful smiles, Elias was something to look at. Someone asked if he specialized in comfort baking. Someone else said, "You must be wonderful around holidays." A third person leaned close and said, "I admire men who don't care about all the pressure to look perfect." Elias felt the words settle on him like dust. He wanted to stand up. He wanted to walk out. He wanted to call Milo and tell him he was sorry, but $500 was not worth this slow, polite humiliation. Then a man took the empty chair beside him. The room did not exactly go silent, but it shifted. Posture straightened. Even Rhett, across the table, suddenly looked alert. Elias glanced sideways. The man beside him was tall, composed, and dressed in a charcoal suit that looked simple until you noticed how perfectly it fit. His dark hair was brushed back without seeming too styled, and his face had the calm stillness of someone used to being watched. Not watched the way Elias was watched. This was different. People looked at this man as if his attention had value. Rhett leaned in immediately. "Killian, I didn't know you were coming." "Last minute change," the man said. His voice was low, controlled, not cold but not warm enough to be used carelessly. Rhett began making introductions with too much eagerness. "This is my cousin, Elias Bellamy. He runs a little bakery in Astoria." A little bakery. Elias felt something inside him tighten. But before he could decide whether to smile or disappear, Killian Cullen turned fully toward him. Not his body. Not over his shoulder. Not through him. At him. "A bakery," Killian said. "That sounds more useful than most things being discussed in this room." Elias blinked. A few people laughed politely, unsure whether it was a joke. Killian reached for the bread plate in the center of the table, selected a slice, and placed it near Elias, as if asking an expert to examine evidence. "What do you think of this sourdough?" Elias stared at him for half a second. No one had asked him a real question all night. Not a decorative question. Not a social question. A real one. He picked up a slice. The crust was too even. The crumb too pale. It looked impressive, but it had no smell beyond salt and surface. He tore a piece and tasted it. Then he forgot to be careful. "It's trying too hard," Elias said. Killian's mouth curved slightly. "That bad?" "Not bad. Just afraid." Elias looked at the bread again. Bread like this wants to be admired more than eaten. The crust is pretty, but there's no depth. No patience. No warmth. The table had quieted. Elias realized he had spoken too honestly. Heat rose in his face. But Killian did not laugh at him. He leaned back, studying the bread with unexpected seriousness. "So what makes good bread?" Elias should have given a simple answer. Flour, water, salt, time. Instead, maybe because the night had already hurt him enough, he told the truth. Good bread has to be allowed to become itself. You can guide it, but you can't bully it into being perfect. The best loaves usually have a crack somewhere. That's how you know they were alive in the oven. For a moment, Killian said nothing. Something passed across his face too quickly for Elias to name. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. Then Killian laughed softly. Not the kind of laugh people used when they wanted others to notice how amused they were. A real laugh. Across the table, Rhett's smile tightened. Elias noticed it, and for the first time that night, he did not feel like the joke. Dinner continued, but something had changed. Killian kept speaking to him. Not constantly, not performatively, but with a quiet attention that made the noise of the room less sharp. He asked about early mornings at the bakery, about the difference between bread made for beauty and bread made for hunger, about why Elias chose rye when most customers preferred something softer. Elias answered carefully at first, then less carefully. He found himself explaining things he usually kept to himself. How he liked being alone before sunrise. How dough changed under your hands depending on the weather. How some customers came in every day for the same loaf because routine could be its own kind of comfort. Killian listened. That was the dangerous part. He did not interrupt to make himself sound clever. He did not glance around to see who was watching. He listened like Elias's words had weight. By the time dessert arrived, Elias had forgotten to hold his shoulders smaller. Then Rhett appeared behind him, placing a hand on the back of his chair. Well, Rhett said lightly, I see you two found something to talk about. There was an edge beneath the sentence. Killian looked up at him. Yes, actual substance. Rare evening. Rhett laughed, but the sound did not reach his eyes. Elias looked down to hide his expression. For years, he had been trained to accept small cruelties as the price of being included. He knew how to laugh when people reduced him to the safe, warm, oversized friend. He knew how to make himself useful before anyone decided he was too much. But Killian Cullen had looked at him as if none of those rules applied. And that was more frightening than being mocked. At the end of the dinner, Elias stepped toward the elevators, ready to leave before the spell broke. He had survived the night. He had earned the money. He could go home, wash off the expensive room, and return to a life he understood. Then Killian's voice came from behind him. Elias. He turned. Killian stood a few feet away, one hand in his coat pocket, his expression unreadable under the soft hallway lights. For what it's worth, Killian said, that was the first honest conversation I've had all week. Elias did not know what to do with that. So he gave a small, awkward smile. That's a little sad. It is, Killian said. But less sad now. The elevator doors opened behind Elias. For 1 second, neither of them moved. Then Killian added, Your bakery, what time do you open? Elias felt his heartbeat change. 6. That's early. It's bread. Killian's smile returned, small but real. Then maybe I'll come when the bread is still honest. The elevator began to close. Elias stepped inside, still looking at him. And just before the doors shut completely, he saw Rhett watching from the end of the hallway, no longer smiling at all. Killian Cullen came to the bakery 3 mornings later. At first, Elias thought it was coincidence. The bell above the door rang just after 7, during the usual rush when half the neighborhood wanted coffee before work and the other half wanted pastries warm enough to fog the paper bags. Elias barely looked up while sliding croissants onto a tray. Morning, he said automatically. Then he heard the voice. I hope I'm not too late for the honest bread. Elias looked up so quickly he almost dropped the tray. Killian stood near the counter in a dark wool coat, one hand wrapped around his phone, the other tucked into his pocket. He looked cleaner than the bakery deserved, like someone had accidentally walked into the wrong movie set. For a second, Elias wondered if the entire dinner had somehow rearranged itself into a joke he still had not fully understood. But Killian did not look amused. He looked tired. Not dramatic tired. Not messy. Just the kind that settled behind someone's eyes after too many nights spent awake. Elias cleared his throat. We've got rye left. That sounds promising. One of the older regulars near the register glanced between them with obvious curiosity. Elias suddenly became aware of the flour on his shirt. He grabbed a loaf from behind the counter and said, You probably don't want the fancy stuff here either. I don't think I've ever wanted fancy bread. That's because rich people ruin everything. Killian laughed softly. The sound did something strange to Elias's chest. Not butterflies. He was too old to call it that. It felt more like relief. Like loosening a button you did not realize had been digging into your skin all day. Killian came back again 2 days later. Then again the following week. Never dramatically. Never with flowers or flirting or anything that would make Elias suspicious. Sometimes he brought work with him and sat quietly near the window with coffee while answering emails. Sometimes he stayed only 10 minutes before disappearing back into Manhattan. But little by little, his visits stopped feeling accidental. They became part of the rhythm of the bakery. Elias started expecting the bell around certain hours. Started looking up automatically whenever the door opened. And that realization annoyed him more than it should have. One rainy afternoon, Killian arrived during a slow hour carrying too much exhaustion in his posture to hide it properly. Elias leaned against the counter. You look terrible. That's the nicest thing anyone said to me today. Long week. Long people. Elias snorted. Killian loosened his tie slightly and looked around the bakery. How do you do this every day? Do what? This. Killian gestured vaguely. The noise. The routine. The same place over and over. Elias shrugged. I like routine. You really do. There's comfort in knowing what comes next. Killian looked at him for a moment longer than necessary. That must be nice. The answer sat heavier than it should have. Elias had met lonely people before. New York was full of them. But Killian's loneliness felt strange because it existed inside someone who technically had everything. Money, reputation, beauty, success. People probably crowded around him constantly. Yet every time he sat in the bakery, he looked like a man finally putting down something heavy. One evening, the bakery lost power during a storm. The lights flickered twice before the entire room dropped into darkness. Someone near the front cursed. The espresso machine died with a pathetic hiss. Elias sighed. Perfect. Most customers left within minutes, muttering about refunds and weather. Eventually, only rain remained, hammering against the windows in thick silver streaks. And Killian. He sat near the counter watching Elias move around with a flashlight balanced between his shoulder and jaw while trying to save a batch of dough before it overproofed. You know, normal people would stop working, Killian said. Normal people don't wake up at 3 in the morning voluntarily either. Fair point. Elias continued kneading by hand beneath the weak glow of his phone light. There was flour across his forearms and a streak near his cheek. His shirt sleeves were rolled unevenly, exposing thick wrists dusted white. After several quiet minutes, Killian spoke again. You love this place. Elias did not look up. Most days. That wasn't what I asked. Elias slowed slightly. Outside, thunder rolled across the city. Finally, he admitted, yeah, I do. Why? The question should have been simple, but it wasn't. Elias pressed both palms into the dough. Because bread is honest. Killian smiled faintly. You keep saying that like it means more than bread. It does. The room settled into silence again. Not awkward silence. Warm silence. The kind Elias rarely shared with anyone. After a while, Killian climbed onto the stool behind the counter and loosened his cuffs. Teach me something. Elias blinked. About baking? Unless you secretly know brain surgery. You'd be terrible at baking. I'm already terrible at most domestic activities. That's concerning for a grown man. Killian leaned closer slightly. And yet you still let me come here. Elias felt heat crawl unexpectedly into his face. He turned away before Killian noticed and shoved a smaller piece of dough toward him. Fine. Fold it gently. Killian immediately pressed too hard. Elias groaned. You're assaulting it. It's dough, Elias. It has feelings. That earned him another laugh. And somehow, standing there in the dark bakery while rain battered the windows and flour covered both their hands, Elias realized something dangerous. He was comfortable. Not performative, comfortable. Not trying to be likable, comfortable. Actually comfortable. Killian looked at him the way people looked at warmth during winter. Like they wanted to stay near it. Later that night, after the power finally returned, they closed the bakery together. Killian helped stack chairs badly. Elias fixed them behind his back without comment. When they finally stepped outside, the storm had faded into cold drizzle. The streets glistened beneath traffic lights and storefront signs. You heading home? Elias asked. Killian nodded. Eventually. That sounds ominous. It's Manhattan. Everything sounds ominous. Elias laughed quietly. For a second, they just stood there under the bakery awning while taxis hissed through wet streets nearby. Then Killian looked at him and said, very casually, you know, I've started measuring my weeks by this place. Elias frowned slightly. That can't be healthy. Probably not. The honesty in his voice caught Elias off guard. Killian stepped closer, just enough for Elias to notice the rain gathered along the collar of his coat. I spend most of my life around people trying to impress each other, Killian admitted quietly. Here nobody cares who I am. That's because Mrs. Alvarez only cares whether you tip properly. I knew she was judging me. She judges everyone. Killian smiled again, softer this time. And before Elias could prepare himself for it, Killian reached out and brushed his thumb lightly across Elias's cheek. Elias froze. There, Killian murmured. Flour. The touch lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it stayed behind like heat long after Killian pulled away. Neither of them moved immediately after. Rain tapped softly against the awning overhead. Cars passed. Somewhere down the block, someone laughed too loudly. And suddenly Elias became terrifyingly aware of how close they were standing. Killian seemed to realize it too. His expression shifted slightly, something quieter and more uncertain slipping through the calm. Then his phone buzzed sharply in his pocket. The moment broke. Killian glanced at the screen, and whatever he saw pulled that careful Manhattan composure back over him almost instantly. "There's my real life," he said dryly. Elias hated how disappointed that made him feel. Killian slid the phone away without answering yet. "I should go." "Probably." But neither of them moved right away. Finally, Killian stepped backward toward the curb. Then, before opening the car door waiting nearby, he looked back once more and said, "Don't give my seat away tomorrow morning." And for the rest of the night, long after the bakery lights were off and the city had gone quiet outside his apartment window, Elias could not stop thinking about the way Killian had said tomorrow. After that night in the rain, something between them changed. Not suddenly. Not enough for either of them to name it out loud. But the space between friendship and something more had started disappearing, little by little, until Elias could feel it every time Killian walked through the bakery door. The dangerous part was how natural it felt. Killian became woven into his routine so quietly that Elias stopped noticing when it happened. Morning coffee waiting on the counter before he even ordered it. Text messages arriving late at night, asking ridiculous questions like, how illegal would it be to survive entirely on cinnamon rolls? Long conversations after closing time while Elias cleaned trays and Killian pretended he was helping. Most people in Elias's life took energy from him. Killian did the opposite. One Thursday evening, Killian invited him to his studio for the first time. "It's not impressive after hours," he warned while unlocking the glass doors. "It just smells like expensive wood and sleep deprivation." Elias stepped inside and immediately felt underdressed for the air itself. The studio was huge, all soft lighting, dark shelves, and massive tables covered with material samples and sketches. Models of unfinished interiors sat beneath spotlights like tiny museum exhibits. "This place probably costs more than my entire apartment building," Elias muttered. "Unfortunately, yes." Killian shrugged off his coat and loosened his sleeves. Without the polished outer layer, he looked younger somehow, less untouchable. Elias wandered slowly through the room, studying fabric swatches and blueprints. "You made all this?" "My team did most of it." "That's not what I asked." Killian glanced at him, then smiled slightly. "Yeah, I did." There was no arrogance in it. That surprised Elias most. A lot of successful people performed humility like another luxury accessory. Killian didn't. He simply seemed tired of pretending his life was smaller than it was. Elias stopped near a large unfinished model near the back wall. "You really like clean spaces, huh?" "I like spaces that let people breathe." Elias looked around the nearly perfect studio. "It feels lonely." The words slipped out before he could soften them. For 1 second, he thought he had crossed a line. But Killian only stared at the model quietly before saying, "Yeah." That answer stayed with Elias the entire night. Over the next few weeks, they started slipping into each other's lives in ways that felt almost domestic. Killian took him to tiny restaurants hidden beneath train tracks in Brooklyn where nobody recognized him. Elias dragged Killian into grocery stores at midnight because he refused to buy overpriced herbs from luxury markets. They learned each other's habits. Killian always checked restaurant glasses for water spots before drinking. Elias always stole fries before pretending he wasn't hungry. Killian hated silence during car rides, but loved silence during walks. Elias talked more when he was tired. None of it should have mattered, but it did. Because intimacy was not built from grand gestures. It was built from repetition. One night, after Elias closed the bakery early, Killian invited him over for dinner. "I should warn you," Killian texted. "This may become a medical emergency." Elias arrived 20 minutes later to find smoke drifting from the kitchen. "Oh my God." Killian looked deeply offended. "It's under control. There's literally smoke." "That's flavor." Elias pushed past him toward the stove. "Move." Watching Killian attempt to cook was one of the funniest experiences of Elias's adult life. The man could negotiate million-dollar contracts, direct teams of architects, and somehow remember every tiny preference Elias had ever mentioned. But he absolutely could not cook. At one point, he held up a wooden spoon and asked, completely serious, "How do you tell if garlic is burning?" "The smell. That feels subjective." Elias laughed so hard he had to lean against the counter. And then he noticed Killian watching him. Not casually, not distractedly, watching him like the sound mattered. Elias slowly stopped laughing. The apartment suddenly felt too quiet. Killian spoke first. "You do that a lot less lately." "What?" "Look like you're waiting for someone to laugh at you first." Elias's chest tightened unexpectedly. He looked away. "You notice weird things?" "I notice you." The room went still after that. Neither of them moved. Outside the windows, Manhattan glowed gold against the dark sky. Somewhere below, traffic hummed endlessly through the streets. But inside the apartment, everything narrowed into the space between them. Elias tried to joke his way out of it. "That line probably works on people. I wasn't trying to make it work." That honesty was becoming dangerous. Killian stepped closer slowly, giving Elias enough time to pull away if he wanted. Elias didn't. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he had to shrink himself before someone touched him. Killian lifted one hand carefully, almost cautiously, and brushed his fingers against Elias's wrist. Just that. Nothing dramatic. But Elias felt it everywhere. "You should stop looking at me like that," Elias murmured. "How am I looking at you? Like I'm something you've been tired of missing." Killian's expression changed slightly. And then, very softly, he said, "Maybe I am." Elias kissed him first. Or maybe they met halfway. Later, he would not remember exactly who moved first. Only the feeling of warmth and hesitation and relief colliding all at once. The kiss was slow, careful, like both of them understood something fragile had just been placed between them. Killian's hand settled against Elias's jaw gently, almost reverently, and Elias felt his entire body react to the tenderness of it. Not hunger, not possession, tenderness. That was somehow worse, because tenderness stayed. When they finally pulled apart, neither spoke immediately. Killian rested his forehead lightly against his for a second before letting out a quiet breath. "You have no idea what you're doing to me," he admitted. Elias smiled faintly, trying to steady his heartbeat. "Pretty sure you kissed me too." "That's not what I meant." The way he said it made Elias's stomach twist painfully, because for one terrifying moment, he believed this could become real. And that was the problem. Once something became real, you could lose it. At first, things only got softer after that. Killian started touching him casually now, a hand at his back while crossing streets, fingers brushing his shoulder while passing behind him. Small things that made Elias feel chosen in ways he had spent years pretending not to need. But then Elias started noticing the gaps. Killian never touched him like that around other people. At restaurants, the distance returned. At public events, Killian became composed again. Elegant, controlled, untouchable. Once they ran into two designers outside a gallery. Killian immediately stepped half a pace away from Elias before introductions even started. The movement was tiny, almost invisible, but Elias felt it like a slap. "This is Elias," Killian said smoothly. "A friend. A friend." The word lodged itself somewhere beneath Elias's ribs. Killian probably didn't even realize the damage he had done. That almost made it worse. Later that night, Elias stood alone in his apartment kitchen, staring at the half-finished loaf on the counter while his thoughts spiraled somewhere ugly. He knew Killian cared about him. That was obvious now. But caring privately and choosing someone publicly were different things. And Elias had spent too much of his life being hidden. The next morning, Killian arrived at the bakery like usual. Coffee, dark coat, calm expression, routine, safe. But Elias noticed things differently now. The careful distance when customers looked their way. The restraint in Killian's posture. The way his eyes softened only when nobody else was paying attention. Killian leaned against the counter. "You look tired." So do you. Occupational hazard. Elias forced a small smile. Killian studied him for a moment longer, sensing something off. What happened? Elias almost answered honestly. Instead, he looked down at the dough beneath his hands and said quietly, "Nothing." But for the first time since Killian Cullen walked into his bakery, Elias wasn't sure that was true anymore. The first real fight started with silence. Not shouting, not accusations. Just a quiet shift Elias could feel every time Killian checked his phone and looked distracted afterward. The bakery had become busier heading into winter. People wanted warmth when the weather turned cold, and Elias spent most mornings elbow-deep in dough while customers crowded the front counter asking for cinnamon loaves and espresso. Usually, Killian's presence settled him. Lately, it unsettled him instead, because now Elias noticed every hesitation, every glance around crowded rooms before touching him, every careful choice of words. Every moment Killian acted like affection was something dangerous outside private spaces. One afternoon, Killian arrived late and exhausted. His coat was damp from snow, and there were faint shadows beneath his eyes. "Tough day?" Elias asked while sliding a coffee toward him. Killian exhaled slowly. "Investor meetings." "That sounds painful." "You have no idea." Normally Elias would have teased him more, tried to pull him out of that distant mood. But something heavy had been growing between them for weeks now, and neither of them seemed willing to name it first. Killian noticed the difference immediately. "You're quiet today." "I'm working." "That's not an answer." Elias wiped flour from the counter harder than necessary. "Maybe I'm tired too." Killian watched him carefully. That look always made things harder. The patient one. The one that acted like he could see through every wall Elias tried to build. Before either of them could continue, Killian's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen and muttered something under his breath. "What?" "Nothing." That definitely sounded like something. Killian rubbed one hand over his face. "There's a dinner tonight. People involved in the new development project downtown." "You going?" "I have to." Elias nodded once. "Okay." Killian hesitated, then carefully said, "It's probably not your kind of evening." The second the words left his mouth, both of them felt it. Elias went still. "Not your kind of evening." The same language, the same polite distancing, the same careful sorting of people into categories. Killian noticed the expression on his face immediately. "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" "I meant stressful, formal, exhausting." Elias gave a small, humorless laugh. "Right." Killian stepped closer. "Elias." But Elias shook his head before he could explain further. "It's fine." It wasn't fine, and both of them knew it. That night, Elias tried not to think about where Killian was. He failed. By 10 o'clock, he was still awake on the couch with the television running unnoticed in the background while his thoughts spiraled somewhere ugly. He hated this feeling, hated how quickly Killian had become important enough to hurt him. Around 11:30, his phone buzzed. "Killian, still awake?" Elias stared at the message for a long moment before replying. Unfortunately, 3 dots appeared immediately. "Come downstairs." Elias frowned. "What?" Another message came. "Just come downstairs." Confused, Elias grabbed his hoodie and headed outside. Cold winter air hit him instantly. And there, parked crookedly near the curb like he had abandoned all concern for appearances, was Killian's car. Killian stepped out before Elias even reached the sidewalk. No perfect composure tonight. His tie hung loose around his neck. Snow melted slowly in his dark hair. He looked irritated in the specific way rich, controlled people looked when they were one inconvenience away from losing their minds completely. "What happened to you?" Elias asked. Killian let out a sharp breath. "I left." "Left what?" "The dinner." Elias blinked. "You just walked out?" "Yes." "Why?" Killian looked at him like the answer should have been obvious. "Because I spent 2 hours listening to people talk about authenticity while treating half the world like decoration." Elias crossed his arms against the cold. "Sounds familiar." Something flickered across Killian's face. "Guilt." "There it is," Elias said quietly. "There what is?" "That look you get when you realize I noticed something." Killian went still. Snow drifted silently around them. Cars passed somewhere farther down the street, tires hissing over wet pavement. Finally, Killian spoke carefully. You've been angry with me. Have I? Yes. Well, congratulations on your observational skills. Elias. No, seriously. You're incredible at noticing things when they finally become inconvenient. Killian's jaw tightened slightly. That was rare. I know I haven't handled this perfectly, he admitted. This? Killian looked frustrated now. Us. The word hit harder than Elias expected. Us. Not friend. Not nothing. Us. And somehow that only made the ache worse. Elias laughed softly, exhausted. Do you know what the problem is? Tell me. You make me feel loved when we're alone. Killian's expression shifted immediately. But the second other people exist, Elias continued, everything changes. That's not fair, isn't it? Killian stepped closer. You know what my life is like. And you know what mine is like. That's different. Elias stared at him in disbelief. You really said that out loud. I didn't mean. No, let's stay there for a second. Elias's voice stayed calm, which somehow made it sharper. Different how? Killian dragged a hand through his hair, visibly struggling now. You don't understand what happens when people get involved in my personal life. And you don't understand what it feels like to always be hidden. Silence. Heavy and immediate. Elias could see the conflict all over Killian's face now. Fear. Frustration. Something painfully close to panic. That realization hurt almost as much as the rest of it. Because Killian did care. He was just terrified. And maybe that should have been enough. But Elias had spent too much of his life accepting half love simply because it arrived wrapped in tenderness. I'm not asking you to make some dramatic announcement, Elias said quietly. I'm asking not to feel like you're secret. You are not a secret. Then why do I only feel wanted behind closed doors? Killian opened his mouth. Stopped. That was answer enough. Elias felt something inside him finally crack. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a quiet exhaustion settling into his chest. I can't keep teaching people how to love me out loud, he admitted softly. Killian looked genuinely stricken now. Elias, I know you care about me. Edo. That's the problem. Snow landed slowly against the shoulders of Killian's coat, while neither of them moved. Elias's throat tightened painfully. Because this was the cruel part. If Killian had been cold, this would have been easier. If he had been cruel, selfish, careless, easier. But Killian looked at him like losing him would hurt, and still could not step fully into the light beside him. Finally, Elias stepped backward toward the apartment entrance. Killian's voice turned rough for the first time since they met. Don't do this. Elias almost broke at the sound of it. Instead, he asked quietly, do what? Leave. The honesty in that single word nearly destroyed him. But Elias forced himself to hold Killian's gaze anyway. I think, he said carefully, you build a life where everything looks beautiful from the outside. Killian's breathing slowed. And I don't think you realize how lonely it is in there. Neither of them spoke after that. For several seconds, all Elias could hear was the wind and the distant sound of traffic. Then he opened the apartment door behind him. Killian still hadn't moved. For one terrible moment, Elias almost crossed the distance between them again. Almost gave in. Almost chose the safety of being loved quietly over the risk of losing him completely. But he didn't. He stepped inside instead. And as the door closed between them, Elias caught one final glimpse of Killian standing alone beneath the falling snow, looking for the first time like a man who suddenly understood that all the beautiful things he built might still leave him empty. The bakery felt different after Killian stopped coming. Not quieter. If anything, December made the place louder than ever. Customers packed shoulder to shoulder every morning, scarves damp from snow, hands wrapped around hot coffee cups while holiday music played too softly through old speakers near the kitchen. But underneath all the noise, something was missing. Elias noticed it most around 7:30. That had become Killian's time. The bell above the door would ring. Cold air would sweep inside, and Killian would appear carrying exhaustion and expensive wool coats and those small, tired smiles he only seemed to wear around Elias. Now every time the bell rang, Elias looked up automatically anyway. Every single time. It annoyed him. It also hurt more than he expected. 3 days passed. Then 5. Then 8. Milo finally noticed. You're glaring at the front door like it owes you money. Elias kept kneading dough. I'm working. Sure. I am. Milo leaned against the counter with the deeply irritating confidence younger brothers seemed born with. So, this has nothing to do with the hot architect guy disappearing? Elias nearly crushed the dough. He's not hot. Milo stared at him. Okay, that was embarrassing for both of us. Elias sighed and rubbed flour across his forehead. Can you go bother someone else? Nope. Mom already got tired of me. Despite himself, Elias laughed quietly. Then the laugh faded just as quickly. Milo noticed that too. You miss him, he said more gently. Elias kept his eyes on the counter. That's not the problem. What is? The answer came before Elias could stop it. I got used to being loved a certain way. The words sat heavily between them. Milo frowned slightly. That sounds bad. Yeah. Do you think he didn't love you? Elias's hand stopped moving. That was the worst part. No, he admitted quietly. I think he did. And somehow that made losing him harder. Because if Killian had been careless, Elias could have hated him. Anger would have protected him. Instead, he just missed him. Missed the quiet mornings. Missed the way Killian listened. Missed feeling seen. That night, after closing, Elias stayed late pretending he still had work to finish. In reality, he was just avoiding the silence, waiting upstairs in his apartment. The bakery smelled like cinnamon and yeast and lingering warmth from the ovens. Outside, snow drifted steadily across the streetlights. Elias was wiping down the counter when the bell above the door rang. His heart reacted before his brain did. And there he was. Killian stood just inside the doorway, with snow melting slowly onto his dark coat. He looked exhausted. Not polished exhaustion this time. Real exhaustion. Like he had not slept properly in days. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Elias quietly said, "We're closed." I know. Killian's voice sounded rough. Elias forced himself to keep wiping the counter, even though his pulse had gone uneven. You forgot your key to the city? Killian almost smiled. Almost. Instead, he stepped farther inside and closed the door behind him carefully. The bakery suddenly felt very small, very warm, very dangerous. You look terrible, Elias muttered. I've heard that before. Silence settled again. Not comfortable this time. Heavy. Killian finally spoke first. I went to the signing event. Elias kept wiping the same clean spot on the counter. And I left halfway through. That made Elias look up. Killian met his eyes steadily now. I walked out in the middle of my own presentation. Elias blinked. You're kidding. No. Why? Killian let out a slow breath. Because all I could think about was you. The honesty in his voice hit Elias hard enough to hurt. Killian stepped closer carefully, like he understood one wrong movement might send Elias retreating again. I kept looking at the room, he admitted, and realizing I didn't care anymore. Elias folded the towel slowly in his hands just to keep them occupied. You should care, he said quietly. I used to. That project mattered to you. It did. Elias frowned. Then why throw it away? Killian's expression softened painfully. Because I finally realized I built an entire life around being acceptable. The bakery fell silent except for the soft hum of refrigeration units in the back kitchen. Killian looked around slowly before continuing. My apartment. My company. My reputation. Everything is designed to make people comfortable around me. He swallowed once. Then I met you. Elias's chest tightened. You walk into a room exactly as you are, Killian said quietly. And somehow you still make it warmer. Elias looked away immediately. You don't get to say things like that after disappearing for over a week. I know. You hurt me. Killian nodded once without defending himself. I know that too. That answer nearly broke him. No excuses. No querfele explanations. Just truth. Killian stepped closer again until only the counters separated them. I'm scared, he admitted softly. Elias finally looked at him again. For the first time since they met, Killian Cullen did not look controlled. He looked exposed. I spent years learning how to survive by keeping parts of myself separate, Killian continued. Private. Contained. His voice roughened slightly. Then you came into my life, and suddenly all I wanted was more time with you. More mornings. More conversations. More everything. Elias felt his throat tighten painfully. I didn't know how to want someone without fearing what it would cost. The honesty in that sentence settled deep inside him. Because Elias understood fear. He understood protecting yourself so long that it became instinct. Killian rested one hand lightly against the counter between them. I'm not asking you to forgive me immediately, he said. He paused, searching for the words. I don't want to keep living inside rooms where nobody actually knows me. Elias stared at him for a long moment, then quietly asked, why now? Killian's answer came instantly. Because losing you felt worse than being judged. That did it. Not the wealth. Not the grand gesture. Not the abandoned contract. That. Elias slowly walked around the counter. Killian watched him carefully, almost holding his breath. You really are terrible at timing, Elias murmured. A faint, exhausted laugh escaped Killian. I'm discovering that. You disappeared for 8 days. I know. I was starting to hate you a little. That seems fair. Elias stopped directly in front of him. Close enough to see exhaustion etched beneath Killian's eyes. Close enough to smell snow and cold air still clinging to his coat. You scared me, Elias admitted quietly. Killian's face softened immediately. I know. And the worst part is, Elias swallowed once. I still missed you anyway. Something raw flickered across Killian's expression then. Relief. Guilt. Want. Probably all three. Slowly, carefully, Killian lifted one hand toward Elias's face like he was still uncertain he deserved to touch him. This time, Elias leaned into it. Just slightly. But enough. Killian exhaled shakily at the contact. I don't know how to do this perfectly, he admitted. Elias gave a tired little smile. Good. I don't trust perfect anymore. Killian laughed softly. And that sound, warm, relieved, real, finally loosened the last tight knot in Elias's chest. So Elias reached up, grabbed the front of Killian's coat gently, and pulled him down into a kiss. Soft. Slow. Nothing desperate about it. Just warmth returning after a long, cold stretch. Killian kissed him back immediately, one hand sliding carefully against Elias's jaw while the other settled at his waist like he had wanted to hold him there for days. Outside, snow continued falling quietly beyond the bakery windows. Inside, everything smelled like coffee, cinnamon, and fresh bread. When they finally pulled apart, Killian rested his forehead lightly against Elias's. I missed you, he whispered. Elias smiled faintly. Yeah, he said softly. I know. Months later, on a freezing morning near the end of winter, Elias stood near the ovens shaping dough while sunlight spilled pale gold across the bakery windows. The place had expanded slightly now. Not transformed, just grown. There were more tables, better equipment, fresh paint. But the old wooden sign still hung near the register exactly where it always had. Killian refused to change it. You can't improve perfection, he had said once. Elias nearly threw flour at him for that. Now Killian stood behind him in rolled up sleeves, arms wrapped loosely around Elias's waist while waiting for coffee to brew. Comfortable. Natural. No hiding. Elias glanced toward the window and caught sight of their reflection together. His body had not changed. Still broad. Still heavy. Still taking up space. But for the first time in his life, he did not instinctively try to make himself smaller. Killian kissed the side of his shoulder gently. You're thinking too hard again. Occupational hazard. Liar. Elias smiled despite himself. Then Killian murmured quietly against his shoulder. You know what I like most about you? What? The fact that you never fit into spaces built for less. And this time, finally, Elias believed him. And maybe that was the real kind of love after all. Not changing someone into perfection, but giving them enough warmth to finally stop hiding. Thank you for listening to Elias and Killian's story tonight. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay for the next emotional journey.